All right, I think this is a really cool panel because we got the ladies up here, which is pretty darn unusual at a Pulpfest. Our moderator is Pulpfest's own Ed Hulse, also editor of Blood and Thunder. My immediate left is David Cunningham. Her grandpop was Frederick Davis, creator of the Moon Man, Operator 5, and many, many other characters. This is Nicky Wheeler-Nicholson Brown. Her grandfather wrote a lot of adventure tales, and he kind of created a comic book company called DC Comics. And way down at the end there is Laurie Powers. Paul Powers was her grandfather, and he was a writer for Wild West Weekly and other Western pulps. He also penned a memoir called Pulp Rider. We did have a fourth panelist, Liz Bissett. She was not technically a granddaughter, but she was a grandniece of Norvell Page, who we all know was the lead writer for The Spider and other characters. Unfortunately, Liz could not make it, so we have three great ladies here, and Ed. And as you all know, Ed knows his stuff, so turn it over to these folks.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, this is something I've been looking forward to. You know, usually those of us who get up here and we're talking on the panels, we're usually doing it as historians and fans and collectors. But we're doing it from the outside looking in. We're looking at our favorite authors. We're lucky enough tonight to have people who have a personal connection, a familial connection. And so with that in mind, hopefully we will get some insights and some thoughts about how our hobby, our passion, looks to people who didn't really grow up with it, who came to it as a result of investigating their own families and following the careers of their own relatives. So I want to start by asking Karen, and then Nicky and Laurie, tell us how it was. You knew that your grandfather was a writer. Tell us a little bit about how, as a young girl, what he did meant to you. How was it mysterious? Was it? How did you come to find out, and what attracted you about it? What was it that made you curious about wanting to learn more about what he did?
Okay. Well, I knew my grandfather when I was young. He lived in Florida. We lived in Ohio, so we only got to see him occasionally. Of course, Florida is a great place to go for vacation. And so maybe once a year we'd go down and visit him. And he was an author. I knew him as an author of murder mysteries. He wrote in his later years primarily under his pseudonym of Stephen Ransom. And every few years he was sending us a new book that he had put out. And I always enjoyed, reading his murder mysteries. And I just thought it was super cool that my grandfather was a writer and he was published, and I could sit and read his books and say, yeah, my grandfather wrote those. But we didn't really know anything about his early career at all until after he passed away. He passed away in 1977 when I was 15. Left behind books, of course, which I have. Left behind some papers, some letters people had written him in recent years that he had saved, where people had corresponded with him about some of his early work, and left behind a suitcase full of old pulp magazines and some stories cut out of old pulp magazines, which we kind of looked at and said, okay, well, we don't really know what to do with these. So they were in storage for quite some time. And once I grew up and got married and had my own house, my dad gave them to me to put them in storage in my house. And they sat in the suitcase for a while. And it wasn't until probably early to mid-90s, I was at the library at Kent State, where I teach, walking through the reference book section, and I saw books called Crime and Mystery Writers. And I thought, I'm going to look up and see if my grandfather's in here. And I found a little blurb written by Bill Pronzini about his career and listing all these things that he'd written, and it mentioned he'd written over 1,000 Pulp stories. And I was like, wow, I don't think we have 1,000 Pulp stories in the suitcase. So I went home and opened up the suitcase, and there were only like about 70, and a bunch of them had different names. I mean, didn't even seem to be his stories. There were a bunch of boxing stories by Kurt Buckley and some westerns by Hal Dunning, and I'm like, I don't even know who those people are. I later found that Kurt Buckley was one of his pseudonyms. That Hal Dunning had been an author who, when he died, my grandfather took over writing his stories, so those were also his. But we didn't know that at the time. And so I kind of looked at him and said, well, I'd be kind of curious to find out what on earth all these stories were that he wrote, because I have no idea. I kind of put things aside for a while. And then the internet came. And it was probably late 1999, early 2000, I stumbled across an alt Pulp newsgroup. And so I kind of lurked for a little while on the newsgroup, and then I posted a question saying, I looked through some letters my grandfather had, and he got these letters from people asking him about the Pulps. And there's this guy named, Nick Carr, who wrote to him, and another guy named Will Murray, and Bob Weinberg wrote to him, and a Leonard Robbins, and a Nils Hardin, and a Harry Steger wrote to him about this thing called PulpCon 6 he went to in 1977 with Norm Saunders. And are any of these people still around? And a few people answered me back and said, well, as a matter of fact, some of these people are still around. And by the way, this PulpCon thing's still going on, and it's in Dayton. And so in 2000, I went to my first PulpCon in Dayton, knowing absolutely no one, having no idea what to expect, and showed up, and all of a sudden the whole world of Pulp kind of opened up, and I found myself sitting on the floor going through boxes and boxes and pulling out magazines and going, oh my God, his name's on the cover. Oh my God, here's another one. Here's another one. And people were coming up to me and going, oh, I found some more of your grandfather's stuff. And and I'm like, I have to win the lottery to buy all this stuff. So that kind of started it all. And that's where I first started to learn about Pulp.
So, Nicky, your grandfather was, of course, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, who had several careers. He was, of course, in the service, and he became a writer, and he was a very popular writer in the general adventure field, and later on in westerns. And of course, he had another sideline. Now, like all of our ladies up here, you're actually a little too young to have grown up during the Pulp era. So, what was it? Tell us a little about your discovery of your grandfather's literary heritage and these funny little magazines that he wrote for. How is it that you came to these?
Well, my parents were divorced. Can you hear me without the mic? Can you hear me? Okay. My parents were divorced when I was just a baby, so I never really grew up with my grandfather. But my mother, surprisingly, really had a marvelous respect for him, so I always knew, even as a young child, I knew he was a writer, and my mother worked for the United Nations at one point, and occasionally she would get intellectual journals that would have my grandfather's byline on them. So I did know at a pretty young age that he was a writer, and that there was a lot more to him than the whole Superman DC thing. And I was always really, really fascinated with him, but I didn't know anything about the Pulps until I was an adult, and I really reconnected with my family when I was around 30, I guess. And because I came into that family as an adult, and because my aunts and my uncle and my father, who still had tremendous regard for my mother, as an adult, they treated me differently than they did the other kids of my generation, my cousins, so that they were much more, they treated me like a peer. So, and because I was interested, I got a lot of artifacts, I got a lot of stories, and I started recording my aunts, and my grandmother was still alive. There was a character. And, so I got a lot of stories about them secondhand, but I still didn't really know about the Pulps. And everybody in my family was sort of like, oh, yes, you read Pulps, and nobody had ever read them. So my husband, who works in popular media, he went on eBay in the sort of like around 1996 or something, and he found these Pulps of my grandfather's, and he got them, and so I had about 6, and I sat down and I started reading them. Now, I work as an editor and a publisher and a ghostwriter. This is my profession. I'm not just, some blue hair chasing my grandfather's. I work in publishing, and I loved them. And yeah, he's my grandfather, but I really, really loved the stories, and I was hooked. And that was the beginning of me on eBay. And just like Karen said, I was very timid to put myself out into either the comic book world or the pulp world. And I do a lot of lurking for a very long time because I've been researching my grandfather's life and work since about 1997. And this is my first appearance at a pulp convention, so I've been lurking. So, I went to Rich Harvey, invited me to come to Pulp Adventure Con down in New Jersey. I live up in Massachusetts, but obviously I'm not from there. And so that was the first time I went, and I met Ed and John Gunnison and a bunch of other people, and I did the same thing Karen did. I was on the floor. Oh my gosh, yes! And of course, I have my wish list. Today, I found the last Argosy in a cereal that I was trying to get, and I was very excited about that. So I have to tell you, I really, really love the Pulps. I'm just a pulp kind of girl. What can I say?
Laurie, you have a particularly interesting story because in discovering your grandfather's connection to the Pulps, you really learned a lot about your family, and there was you go into great detail in the memoir, Pulp Writer, which, by the way, Laurie is selling down in the dealer's room, which is a terrific book. She did an introduction to her grandfather's memoir. So give us, bring us up to date. Tell us how you got involved and how you discovered what it was your grandfather was doing for a living.
Well, when I grew up, the only thing that I knew about my grandfather was that he was a writer. But I grew up thinking that he had only written one Western novel called Doc Dillahay, which was published by Macmillan in 1949. But my family didn't really want to talk about him very much. My mother didn't like him, and he and my mother and my father divorced when I was very young, and then my father died, a few years after that, and so that whole side of the family just basically disappeared during the 1960s. And then when my grandfather died in 1971, by that point we'd gotten so disconnected from the family that we didn't even know he had died for like 5 or 6 years after that. So it was pretty tough. So, but as I was growing up, he always had this air of mystery about him, like Karen was talking about. And I always thought it was very cool that he was a writer. And somehow, and I don't know what it was, I connected with that. I connected with the fact that he had gone out and done something that very few people can do, which is write for a living and get something published. And I just thought that was the greatest thing. And my sister, I know that she was my oldest sister, I know that she was very proud of that as well, because she had a couple of articles about him that came out after the novel was published, and she had them up on her wall. And in there, the article talks about him writing for Wild West Weekly. And I never saw that. I don't know why. I never saw that when I was growing up. But later on, as I started to do more research about him, and I read that article again, and in there he says that he probably wrote 10 million words of fiction for Wild West Weekly. And I always thought, well, he must have been really drunk when he told them that one. But, he was probably right. But, once I got older, it just seemed like when I was a kid, there was kind of this family attitude, my mother's side of the family, frankly, that, you just weren't supposed to talk about them. So I didn't, I just learned to stop asking the questions. And it wasn't until I was much older and I had gone through my own issues with drinking, I stopped drinking myself, and I just kind of thought, you know what, these guys, even though they had the stigma of being alcoholics, which they still were human beings. They had their dreams, they had their great careers, and none of that had been explored in our family. So I think that's what got me going and deciding to get the courage up to do this, despite what my mother thinks about him, and that's what started the whole thing.
I think at this point we should interject that, it's often said that talent is hereditary, and I think it's pretty amazing that all three of our panelists here are themselves very talented communicators. Laurie and Nicky are both professional writers, and they're both bloggers, by the way. And Karen has been teaching and communicating in various capacities. So I think it's kind of remarkable that the gift comes down from generation to generation. Karen, let's go back to when you got involved and you started reading these stories and tracking them down. I'm wondering what, if anything, did reading these stories tell you about your grandfather? Could you see any of him in his work? Did they tell you anything? Did they illuminate anything about what his imagination was like or how he worked? Anything like that?
Well, I've probably spent more time tracking them down than reading them, to tell you the truth, because trying to track down 1,000 Pulp stories is kind of a life's career. So far, I've tracked down, been able to identify 677, so I still have a few hundred left to go. But I have read some of them, and there are some people who have brought my attention to. I know, I believe it was Dave Kurzman who initially contacted me at one point and said, "Oh, my favorite story of your grandfather's is called, The Mole Men Watch Your Eyes." And it's like, what the heck is that? And so, of course, I had to get it. And it was, and I cannot believe my grandfather wrote this. And I've read some of the Moon Man stuff, and he wrote so many different genres. I mean, in his early years, he wrote air stories, he wrote westerns, he wrote boxing stories, he wrote mysteries, he wrote strange horror stories. And so, having known him, he always seemed really kind of reserved in person. He was not the best conversationalist. Sometimes we would sit and meet with him, and we'd kind of sit there trying to figure out what the heck to say to each other. But he was a very prolific writer. I mean, he cranked out a story a week for years and years and years. So, to be honest, I am stunned sometimes when I read his stories and go, where did all this come from? Because it wasn't something that I saw in speaking with him personally. So they're kind of a surprise to me when I read them.
Nicky, how about you? What is it when you read the Major's works? What is it that appeals to you, that hits you?
Well, there are a lot of things. For one thing, I'm working on a biography of him right now, and so I have actually found that his stories have been really phenomenal in helping me to understand his life, because he did, besides the medieval, he was really into the whole sort of medieval genre, and besides those, there are a lot of his stories that are based on actual events in his life. Because at the same time that I've been tracking down his stories and reading them, I've also been doing research, for instance, in military files at the National Archives, and I've just gotten this really wonderful guy who's helping me find some things that I've had trouble tracking down, because the military files are very intense, and if you're not a military person, it can be very confusing. And a lot of the stories that he wrote are based on places that he was in the military and events that actually happened, and that's kind of thrilling. And as an editor, there are times when you read a person's work, and even somebody like Euripides, that's been translated from the Greek many, many times into English, there's a moment where when you're reading something and you feel like that's the voice, that I hear that person's voice. And that happens to me a lot with some of my grandfather's better written work. There's some that I've come across that I swear I don't think he wrote at all. His name is on them, but they're not like him at all. And I think John Locke was telling me that sometimes they farmed things out. So I think I've happened on some of those. But yeah, and I had this amazing experience 2 years ago. I went to, my grandmother was Swedish, and so I had this whole huge family in Sweden and France, and our families are really close. And my second cousin, my father, I guess that's what he is anyway, my father's first cousin, his mother and my grandmother were sisters. And my cousin Finn took me to Vic-sur-Seine, to the chateau that my grandparents lived in the 20s. And that chateau figures in a number of stories that he wrote. It was so much fun and so amazing to walk around, this incredible setting and know that my grandfather had been inspired by his place. So yeah, I've gotten a lot out of the stories.
Now, Laurie, you're a big fan of Westerns, not only fictional Westerns, but movie Westerns and also Western Americana, Western culture. Did you get that from learning about your grandfather's work, or did you have it already? And if so, how did learning about your grandfather's work enhance your appreciation of the Western?
Actually, I didn't know a thing about Westerns until I started to research him. So it's been, I started from the ground and just, started from there. So I really didn't know that much about him. I watched a few Westerns when I was a kid. I loved Bonanza and Gunsmoke and High Chaparral and F Troop. But no, I really didn't know a lot about that genre until I started to read his stories, and I really started to enjoy them. I thought, these are really kind of a lost art. I really feel that way, and now they are.
So you like them?
Yeah.
Karen, what would you say is the most amazing thing that you've learned about your grandfather and about his works, and really about this whole little subculture of ours?
Oh my. Where to start? Well, I guess the couple of things that I do want to say is that finding this group has been the biggest asset. Absolutely. I mean, I have learned so much from the people here that put together all the indexes, from the people who are doing all the research, who dig through all the publishers' archives, who, have letters my grandfather wrote them that have given me all sorts of information, not just about his work, but about our family. I mean, I've been able to do a lot of genealogical research based on little tidbits of information that came from letters from some of you guys that you've since given to me. And so I so much appreciate all of the work that all of you guys do out there researching this stuff and archiving it and trying to keep it alive and keep track of it. I have learned so much more about him that I wish I'd have known kind of while he was alive. Since I've been on this trek since, again, about 2000, I found at least 10 pseudonyms he wrote under. I've discovered there were 3 movies that were made from his work. I've managed to get hold of all 3 of them at this point. I found at least 1 radio show that I have a copy of, and some clues that there may have been another one that I haven't been able to find any documentation of at all. I did learn from a letter he wrote that his first pulp was in Action Stories. I believe it was November 1921. I'm still looking for that one, so if anybody's got it. Just researching him. And again, the internet's another fabulous resource. Every year it seems like there's more stuff that's on there. A couple years ago I was doing some more research on him. I found things he wrote in 1920 for Photo Era magazine. I found little bits he wrote for Popular Science. I found he'd applied for a patent for a scarf pin when he was 16 years old. All that just from doing internet research. So I guess I've learned all sorts of things that I did not know. And again, it all kind of started coming here, and that kind of piqued my interest. You just keep digging and digging and digging, and there's just more stuff that comes up all the time. So it's kind of like solving a mystery yourself, but just researching all of this stuff.
And Nicky, I'm sure with your grandfather's incredibly varied and storied career, there's probably lots of things, but does anything really jump out as the most amazing thing you've learned about him?
There were a couple of things. One is that this gentleman who's been doing the military research, there was an article that my grandfather wrote in 1942 that I've been searching for, called "Does the Negro Make a Good Soldier?" And it was published in Negro Digest, which was part of Reader's Digest. And I've been dying to get hold of that. And just about 3 weeks ago, this guy managed to get a copy for me. And my mother, who's 86 and has also had almost her entire career has been as a writer and an editor and a publisher. And she's still very compos mentis. And so it came while I was down south with her, and we both got to read it, and we just both thought it was such a phenomenal piece of work. It was so prescient and so well written in terms of what was coming down the pike in terms of integration and how long segregation was, and it was just so beautifully put, and that made me feel very, very proud of him. And I guess that's something that has really struck me about him, is just what an incredible visionary he always was. He didn't really make the money from any of the great ideas that he had, but my impression from my father and my aunts and from his photographs at the end of his life, I don't get the sense that he was unhappy in any way whatsoever. I really get the sense that he was very, satisfied with the life that he had led. So I guess that those are the things that really impressed me.
Yeah, and they are very impressive. Laurie, how about you? What have you learned? Has there been any great light bulb that went off over your head? Any great revelation?
Well, I've learned that the search never ends. Just for example, somebody today, I think it was Rick, that asked me if I had found everything on the list of all of his stories, and I said, well, pretty much, but the thing is that there's always things that aren't on the list that you don't know about. You know, there's always, it just seems like every time I turn around, I'm finding out about another story I didn't even know existed. Like a couple of years ago, you know, and this was after the Pulp writers come out, and my aunt had collected almost all the Wild West weeklies, and about 5 years ago or so, she gave me a box. It's like a box this high, and she said, you know, there's a bunch of stories in here that never got into Wild West Weekly. And so I said, fine. So I put it in the closet. I figured, you know, they were all distilled stories that, you know, didn't go anywhere. And then about 2 years ago, a friend of mine emailed me, and he said, you know, wouldn't it be great if we could find some of these unpublished stories and print them? And I thought of that box, and my guilty conscience just exploded. I thought, oh my God, I've never even looked in there. So I opened it up, and there were about 30 different stories that he'd written after Wild West Weekly had closed up. So we have a lot of westerns that were in there. They were written in the late 1940s. There were all different kinds of genres. There was a noir detective genre in there. There was horror stories. There was nonfiction. And so it just goes to show you, I mean, it just never ends. You know, and Ron Hanna has a whole stack of westerns that he's got. He just casually mentioned them to me today. And he said, yeah, they're from the late 40s. And I thought, I think I need to go through these and look just to see if there's any stories I haven't found yet and didn't even know about. So it's just never stopped.
This is kind of a tough one. I just asked you what kind of revelations you had about your grandfathers. In this whole process, what, if anything, have you learned about yourself? Or what have you found in yourself that you maybe had not suspected? Is there anything, I know it's kind of a weird question, but is there anything that comes to mind in this journey all three of you have taken that you've learned about yourself, about your own tenacity or your own curiosity?
I wasn't prepared for that question. I don't really know how to answer, because I've pretty much always known that when I want something, I'm pretty stubborn about going about getting it. And I like to research stuff, and I like to learn more stuff. I guess I'm kind of surprised at how good I've become at picking up stuff from various places and finding weird places to look and putting little pieces together. I've actually found that's more true even with the genealogy and trying to track that, because we didn't know a whole lot about his heritage. We knew a little bit that his grandfather had been a newspaper publisher, and that he was somewhere in Kansas, and that's all we knew. And if you ever tried to do a genealogical search for the name Davis, oh my God. Plus, people back then kept using initials or their middle names or switching their names around, and I actually did manage to track down who his grandfather was and found copies of microfilm of the newspapers published back in the 1870s from Salina, Kansas, and then Emporia, Kansas, and then Albany, Missouri, and actually tracked him down. I have no idea how. And so I guess that's one thing I guess I've learned. You know, I've been accused of being able to be a really good stalker sometimes too, so I can track people down too. So.
Let me try to fine-tune that question too. Here, let's put another spin on it. Maybe in researching the work of your grandfather, does anything jump out at you that you've discovered about yourself? As the more you find out about him, about them, are there traits that you see? Oh, wait a minute! Oh, he did that. Oh, I do that. He worked this way. I work this way.
I guess it's especially poignant for me since I didn't really know him, and so through my research, you know, he's really become alive to me. And You know, it's always said that a really good biographer falls in love with their subject, and that would be doubly so for me. But yeah, it's been an incredible journey. I mean, you know, the whole DC thing, you know, that gets really crazy sometimes. And I mean, it's so larger than life sometimes. And sometimes I'm doing things and I think, wow, I'm doing this. And it's just kind of amazing. And on my way, I was down south, and I just got back to Massachusetts, where I live. And on my way, I stopped in Greenville, Tennessee, where my grandfather was supposedly born. And they wanted to do, the local paper there wanted me to stop, and they wanted to interview me. And my great-grandfather also was a newspaper man and a surgeon. So, in any case, so I stopped there, and the reporter there is one of those wonderful, wonderful Southern guys, talk your head off, just as sweet as he can be. Meanwhile, you know, he's getting all kinds of really good information. And at one point he said to me, "Nicky, you are just the most adventuresome person. I just can't believe how adventuresome you are. You just go everywhere and do everything." And I thought, wow, I do. Wow. You know, he was just amazed that I travel as an older, mature woman by myself and do all these things and go to Europe and go to Comic-Con and, you know, do all these amazing things, you know, through the search for my grandfather. And I thought, he was an adventuresome person, and I am too. So yeah, it's been kind of really just an incredibly wonderful experience. And he wasn't a perfect person. I've discovered some naughty things too, but that's part of the humanity of it all, you know. And it's just been a phenomenal experience. I'm very, very grateful.
How about you, Laurie? What have you learned?
Well, I was thinking about that while you guys were talking. How am I going to answer this? But it goes back to something that I realized that I do, that in my writing, that I think that my grandfather suffered from also, and that is being extremely critical of our own work and giving up too easily. Like in the example of the stories I was just telling you about, a lot of those manuscripts, he had sent those out for publication, you know, and maybe he had gotten them rejected by one magazine, and he would just put them away. He wouldn't even try to send them out again. And so when I was looking at these, and I thought, man, these are really good. And, you know, so a lot of them are in, we have a new collection out, and a lot of them are in that book now. And I do the same thing, you know, if I do something, if I write a story, let's say, and if somebody even gives me the slightest hint that they didn't like it, I'll give up, you know, I'll put it away. And it's just something that you have to fight all the time. I guess a lot of writers go through that, but it's, you know, by looking at what he did and the lessons that I learned from all of those manuscripts that never went anywhere, you know, it's been a good lesson for me to say, okay, you can't just rely on one person's opinion. You know, you have to follow your own gut and don't give up.
Good lesson. Good lesson. Okay, at this point I'd like to throw it on. I'm sure you all have questions. What I will ask is that when I call on you, please stand up so that everybody can hear you. Speak clearly and loudly, and we'll try and get as many questions in as we can. So, any questions for Laurie, Nicky, or Karen? Yes?
Karen, what are I'm sorry, your grandfather, the stories were made into movies. Can you tell what movies they were?
Did everybody hear the question? No. The question was, what were the 3 movies that Fred Davis's stories were made into?
Okay, the 3 movies were Double Alibi, Who is Hope Schuyler, and Lady in the Death House.
Thank you. Now I got a question for Nicky. Your grandfather's involved in DC. Can you talk more about that? How he got into the comic book field?
Yeah, we presuppose that everybody knows the DC story.
Actually, this is something that I think is very important for this group of people, that I'm sure a lot of you know this, but maybe not everybody does. And that really the basis, this is not just my opinion, I've been doing research into this, and Paul Levitz, whom some of you may know, who was head of DC Comics for many years, and just last year came out with the Red Book, the tome, 75 Years of DC. And Paul and I talk fairly frequently, and he found some interesting stories that he passed on to me. And evidently, my grandfather, when he started comic books in 1934, he was one of the first persons to take all original art and all original stories, and he started More Fun, New Fun, and then Action Comics and Detective Comics. And my grandfather was there throughout all of that. He was there from the beginning of the whole Superman thing. I don't want to get into that. That's a whole other can of worms. But in any case, he specifically brought in pulp writers, and I suspect some pulp artists. Yes, and that's what, David and I had just preliminary conversations.
Anderson was the first color of More Fun. Everybody before Mike Anderson thinks More Fun.
Yes. And I'm interested in learning more about that crossover, because I think it's really important for all of you to particularly understand that the pulps are really the basis and the foundation for that whole comic book hero. The whole thing is really based on the pulps and the pulp writers. Because my grandfather, they used to call him the Major, he had his writers bring in pulps, and they had stacks of pulps sitting in the offices, and they were literally, drawing from those. And he also, a couple of pulps that he wrote became comic strips. And Ron Goulart, years ago, gave me some Xeroxes of one of those stories, and I flipped out because the heroine looked exactly like my grandmother. I couldn't believe it. She was a very distinctive looking person, so it wasn't vague. I mean, obviously, the artist had, he had been inspired by her. And so the pulps, I feel very strongly, are really the foundation for, what the action hero comics, the whole heroic Justice League became.
Those of you who collect Top Notch magazine, the Street and Smith magazine, there's kind of a seminal story in there by the Major called The House of Fang Gao. And Fang Gao was one of the Fu Manchu-like villains in the early comic books. So that was a direct crossover from pulp pages to comics. So did you know about that one?
Yes, and he was in Siberia. He was in military intelligence in 1915, 16, and 17. And he was in Siberia when he was in Japan and probably a little bit of China, but mostly Siberia. But he had a lot of interaction with that whole sort of Asian sensibility. And I don't know if any of you know Dr. John Lent, who does the International Journal of Comic Art out of Temple University in Philadelphia. Really lovely man. And he and I talked quite a bit because my grandfather was also in the Philippines in 1950. And I think, and Dr. Lent and I are going to talk about this some more, but I suspect suspect that my grandfather saw some of those early Japanese, they weren't comic books, but there were some early Japanese sort of manga type things way back then. And I have a feeling that he may have seen some of those things because he was very interested in different cultures. So
That's a whole nother panel. Some more questions? Yes, Michael.
This one's for Karen. I think you also, I was going to ask about the movies, but what did you say about the radio show that your grandfather was involved in, maybe?
The radio show, there was one episode of the Crime Club was a version of Hearst's Don't Hurry. I did find an ad in I think it's Broadcasters Journal. What was it? Yeah, a broadcasting journal from 1945. It's an advertisement for a mystery show called Mr. Fix-It, and it's billed as a half-hour, once-a-week super detective thriller by Frederick C. Davis, but I could find no evidence of its existence whatsoever. So if anybody researches any of that stuff, I'd be really curious if you wrote
When they introduced each show, they actually would, I mean, they had to like intersect with like Burry host, and they actually would mention the author, so I think any ones that existed with him probably would be credited with him or one of his pseudonyms.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, Hearst's Don't Hurry was one of the Davis novels written as Stephen Ransom, and they were first-person novels, and Stephen Ransom was a character. And of course, the Crime Club, which was a Doubleday imprint, was a very prestigious. A lot of the pulp writers aspired to break into the Crime Club. Some more questions? David.
Laurie, you said that,
Speak up. Speak up.
did you say something about your, there was some trouble with your family in terms of your grandfather and the other aspects of the family, like some estrangement or something?
Mm-hmm.
So when Nicky brought up the thing about seeing her grandmother anymore, it made me think, I wonder if you saw your relatives also in a different light. I mean, when you're reading it, you see a female interest or something. Ringing bells for you that it might have been your grandmother also.
I doubt people heard that. What, did anybody hear that in the back? No.
Were there other echoes of your grandparents, grandmothers,
Well, I couldn't find any as far as them in his literature and in his stories, but what was fun is in some of the Wild West weeklies, I found letters to the editor that were written by my father, which is really a lot of fun because in the later years of Wild West Weekly, a new editor came in, John Burr, and he changed the whole format, not the whole format, but he did change the magazine quite a bit. He tried to grow up the stories, and it was a very tumultuous time for a lot of the writers because they weren't used to writing like that. And he and my grandfather just did not get along at first. And so one of the letters in the letters that my father wrote that got in there, I mean, he's giving John Burns just the hardest time. He's saying, have you ever actually been in the West? Do you know what it's like to work on a ranch? Or are you just so comfortable in that chair in New York City? I mean, it's just, what's as great is that he put it in the it was just, the whole thing was just a big tease on him. And so I've seen those, and I just get a big kick out of that. And I could just see my grandfather standing behind him when he's writing this letter, going, yeah.
We got time for one more question. No more questions. All right, well, in that case, I'd like to thank our incredibly intelligent and articulate panelists. What a pleasure it is to have some bright, well, I've said it already. A round of applause for our panelists. We're going to break for a few minutes and then the next presentation will be on. Thanks again for coming.